Welcome to Whispers in the Dark. Imagine waking up to the sound of footsteps above you even though you live alone. And when you check, the room is empty. But then you find something that wasn't there before: your late wife's clothes scattered across the floor. A ghostly figure appears, vanishing into thin air, leaving you trapped in a nightmare that never ends. What happens next? Stay tuned till the shocking twist at the end. Don't forget to subscribe to Whispers in the Dark and support our channel to bring you more chilling tales. The sun had long since dipped beneath the horizon, leaving the vast, endless sky over Sedona to turn a deep shade of indigo, with only a sliver of pale moonlight cutting through the shifting clouds. In the distance, the rugged red rock formation stood like ancient sentinels, silent and immovable, casting long shadows over the land. This was John Walker's world, his home, his sanctuary, and his prison all at once. John had never intended to live in such isolation. As a former soldier, he'd seen death up close and personal, witnessed the chaos of war and the lives that had been torn apart by it. But nothing could compare to the darkness that had descended on his life when Alina, his beloved wife, had died under mysterious circumstances. The weight of her absence was more than just a loss. It was an unexplainable void that consumed every part of his being. It was the quiet hum of a house that once echoed with laughter, now filled only with the soft growls of his dog, Max. He wasn't the man he once was. At 42, the lines on his face had deepened, not from age, but from grief. His body had become a reflection of his soul, tired, worn, and battered. As a mechanic now, he spent most of his days working on old engines, the repetitive motions grounding him, giving him something to focus on so that the memories of Alina, of their life together, wouldn't overwhelm him. But it was hard, too hard, especially when the house, this vast, empty house, seemed to have a life of its own. It breathed with him, lived with him, but also, at times, felt like it was conspiring against him. It was not just the silence that was unsettling. It was the feeling that something was watching, something waiting. The house, built years ago by Alina's grandfather, was large and creaky, with rooms that felt too big for one person. The second story, where Alina had once spent hours reading, sewing, or simply gazing out the window, now seemed to mock him. The room had been left untouched since her death, locked away, her things still where she had left them, her favorite books, her knickknacks, the faint scent of lavender that never seemed to fade. But it wasn't just the house itself that troubled John. It was the land. Sedona was known for its beauty, its strange energy that both captivated and unnerved those who came to visit. The town was a magnet for spiritual seekers, the New Age crowd, those looking for answers that could not be found. Yet for John, Sedona was a reminder of everything that had been stolen from him. The wide, desolate expanse of land outside his home made it feel like he was on the edge of the world, no one around, nothing to keep him grounded except his memories, and sometimes those were more of a curse than a comfort. It was late one evening when it all began to change. John had spent the day in the garage, tightening bolts and fixing engines, his mind clouded by the thick fog of exhaustion. Max had been unusually quiet that day, sticking close to him as though sensing the undercurrent of tension that lingered in the house. After finishing his work, John decided to take a walk, something he did often, though it had become more of a ritual than a desire. The cool air in Sedona felt different at night. It was thick with an almost tangible stillness, the kind that made your skin prickle with the feeling of being watched. As John stepped outside, the moonlight seemed to stretch forever across the desert floor, casting elongated shadows that seemed to dance with the wind. Max padded alongside him, his large paws silent on the dirt path that led around the back of the house. John inhaled deeply, his lungs filling with the crisp, arid air, but even that didn't calm the restlessness inside him. He'd walked this path 1,000 times before. It was familiar, a comfort, something he could lose himself in when the weight of the world felt too heavy. But tonight, something was different. As he neared the far side of the house, his eyes lifted to the second-story window, the bedroom that had once belonged to him and Alina. For a brief, terrifying second, John thought he saw a movement, a figure shifting behind the curtain. His heart skipped a beat, his hand instinctively gripping the flashlight at his side. He stood frozen for a moment, staring at the window, waiting for the figure to reappear, but nothing happened. The house was still, as silent as the desert night. John shook his head. It was nothing, just the wind playing tricks on him. He had been alone for far too long, his mind no doubt starting to break under the pressure of grief. But even as he turned to walk back toward the house, he couldn't shake the feeling that he wasn't alone. Max's low growl broke the silence, and John froze. The dog was standing stiffly, staring up at the second-story window, his hackles raised. John's breath caught in his throat. "Max," he whispered, his voice barely audible. The dog's growl grew louder, more insistent, and then just as suddenly as it had started, Max stopped, his tail tucking between his legs as he turned and trotted nervously back toward the house. John followed, his mind racing. He shouldn't have seen anything in that window. It was impossible. No one had been in that room for years. Still, the feeling of being watched lingered, thick and suffocating, as he climbed the stairs and went back inside. But as he entered the kitchen, his eyes locked on the small table by the door. His breath caught in his throat again. The lights were on. He was sure he had turned them off when he left. Slowly, cautiously, John walked toward the light switch and flicked it off, the silence settling back into the room. But his hands shook as he reached for the door to the basement, then stopped. He had forgotten to lock it. His heart began to pound in his chest. The house had always been quiet, too quiet. But tonight it was different. Something felt off, like an invisible presence in the shadows watching him. And the unsettling thing was, he had no idea what it was. John's hands trembled slightly as he wiped the sweat from his brow. The day had been long, too long, filled with the grinding noise of metal on metal, the stench of oil, and the ache of muscles that no longer had the strength they once did. The hours blurred into one another, and when the final bolt was tightened and the engine was put back into place, John felt as though he could finally breathe. The smell of gasoline hung in the air as he wiped his greasy hands on the rag hanging from his belt loop. The truck, his project, his obsession, was ready for the road again. But as always, it wasn't the work that kept him going. It was the need to forget. Forget the silence in the house. Forget the memories that haunted every corner of this place. Max, his dog, sat by the door, eyes fixed on him with that ever-present expression of loyalty. But even Max, who had been John's constant companion since Alina's passing, seemed different these days. The dog's eyes no longer gleamed with the playful innocence they once had. No, there was a heaviness in those eyes now, a quiet understanding of the world John had shut himself off from. John ran a hand through his short, graying hair and sighed. He could feel the weight of the house pressing in on him, the walls so thick with memories that the air inside was heavy, stifling. He couldn't stay here anymore. Not tonight. He needed to leave, even if it was just for a little while. Without thinking, he grabbed his jacket from the chair and walked toward the door, Max at his heels. The night had fallen over Sedona like a dark, suffocating blanket, and the crisp desert air was a welcome relief. The stars hung above him like cold, distant eyes, watching him as he stepped outside into the vast emptiness of the land he had come to call home. The house sat behind him, dark and silent, but the desert stretched out before him, endless, unyielding. A soft breeze stirred the sand, whispering secrets he could never quite understand. John walked for a few minutes, letting the quiet hum of the desert fill his ears, trying to let his mind clear. He walked past the barnyard, and then towards the back of the house. The path was familiar, a comfort in its repetition. The crunch of gravel beneath his boots was the only sound, punctuated by the occasional rustle of a small animal in the bushes. Then he saw it. At first, it was just a flicker, a brief flash of light from the second-story window, the bedroom that had once belonged to him and Alina. He froze in his tracks. For a moment, he thought it was just the reflection of a passing cloud, or perhaps his eyes playing tricks on him. But as he stood there, heart hammering in his chest, the light flickered again, this time longer, more distinct. A chill ran down his spine. The room had been locked ever since Alina's death. He hadn't set foot in there since the night they had buried her. He couldn't bring himself to. It was her room, the room where they had laughed, cried, loved, and fought. It was a part of their life, and now that she was gone, it was a part of him he couldn't face. But that light, it was impossible. It shouldn't have been there. No one had been in that room for years. No one could be. John's heart skipped a beat. He knew his mind was playing tricks on him. The isolation had gotten to him, the silence of the house, the endless nights with only Max for company. But this was something else. He had to check. He had no choice. Max, who had been walking beside him, stopped dead in his tracks and looked up at the window. His body was tense, his fur standing on end. He growled low in his throat, a sound unlike anything John had ever heard from the dog before. "Max," John whispered, his voice barely audible, but the dog didn't respond. He just kept staring at the window, his growl deepening into a low, menacing rumble. John's pulse quickened. There was something in that room. He was certain of it. His feet moved of their own accord, carrying him up the steps to the front door. He let himself in and rushed through the living room, past the kitchen, up the stairs. His footsteps echoed in the hollow silence of the house, but there was no sound of anything out of the ordinary. He reached the second floor, his breath shallow, and stood in front of the door to the bedroom. His hand hovered over the doorknob for a long moment, the tension thick in the air. And then he turned it. The door creaked as it swung open, the sound scraping against his nerves. He stepped inside, his flashlight beam cutting through the darkness. The room was unchanged. Nothing was out of place, no signs of intrusion, no sign of life. But the air, it was different. The room felt colder, as if it had been locked away in ice for years. The window, which he could have sworn had been shut, was now slightly ajar, allowing the cool night air to seep in. It wasn't much, but it was enough to make his skin crawl. John stepped further into the room, the floorboards groaning under his weight. His flashlight scanned the room, across the bed, the dresser, the nightstand, where Alina's things still rested. He noticed a photo frame on the bedside table, a picture of the two of them from their wedding day. It was tilted slightly to the side, as if someone had been handling it. He took a deep breath and placed the frame back where it belonged. He turned toward the window, feeling a strange compulsion to close it, but as his hand reached for the sill, he saw something that made his heart stop. A shadow, fleeting and barely perceptible, shifted in the far corner of the room. John's blood ran cold. He spun around, the flashlight beam slicing through the darkness, but there was nothing, only the faint rustling of the curtains in the breeze. But the air, it was thick with something else now, something that wasn't quite right. "Hello." His voice cracked as he called out into the silence. No response. Only the oppressive weight of the room pressing in on him. The room seemed to stretch, the walls closing in. His hands began to shake. It was nothing. It had to be. He had imagined it. But deep down in that dark part of his mind, he knew something was wrong. He wasn't alone in this house. Not anymore. John backed out of the room slowly, never taking his eyes off the empty corner where the shadow had been. He shut the door behind him with a soft click, the weight of the silence settling back around him like a suffocating fog. As he stood there, listening to the sound of his own breath, the house felt heavier, darker. He turned to leave, but then Max's growl echoed down the stairs. "Max!" He called, but his voice trembled. The dog stood at the bottom of the stairs, staring up at him with those same wide, unblinking eyes. His body was rigid, ears pricked forward, the low growl still vibrating in his chest. John's skin crawled. Something was in the house, and it was getting closer. John's sleep had never been restful since Alina's death. The quiet was too much to bear, the house too large and too empty, echoing with memories of their life together. He often found himself waking in the middle of the night, unsure of why, his body drenched in sweat, his mind racing with images of things he couldn't name. But tonight it was different. The house had settled into a strange stillness, a calm that almost felt unnatural. John had crawled into bed a few hours earlier, exhausted from the day's work, hoping for some respite. The night outside was cool, the wind stirring the trees outside his window, but within the walls of his house everything was hushed, as though even the air was holding its breath. Then it came, a soft creak, almost imperceptible at first but distinct enough to stir him from his restless sleep. John lay still, his eyes wide open in the dark, straining to hear. There it was again, another creak, then a faint thud, the unmistakable sound of footsteps. He sat up, heart pounding in his chest, and for a moment his mind refused to comprehend what he was hearing. Footsteps. But he was alone. Max was curled up at the foot of the bed, his breathing slow and even, completely unaware. The house was empty. It had to be. John's breath hitched and his hands gripped the edge of the mattress as he tried to listen more intently. The sound came from above, from the second floor. The footsteps were slow, deliberate, like someone was pacing back and forth as if they were waiting for something. But there was no one up there. His mind raced. It had to be the wind. Maybe the old house was just settling, the floorboards creaking in the cold of the night. But no, there was something about the rhythm of the steps, slow, measured, purposeful, that made his blood run cold. His pulse quickened, a cold sweat forming on his brow. Slowly, carefully, he swung his legs over the side of the bed and stood up. The floorboards groaned under his weight as he made his way to the door, his every movement heavy with a sense of impending dread. He reached for the flashlight on the bedside table, his hand trembling as he turned it on. Max remained unfazed, still asleep, oblivious to the creeping tension in the air. John crept toward the stairs, each step he took seemingly louder than the last, the creaking of the floorboards beneath him almost mocking him with their volume. The sound of footsteps from above was still there, echoing through the house like a clock ticking, each footfall a countdown to something he wasn't ready to face. He reached the foot of the stairs and paused, the beam of the flashlight cutting through the dark like a blade. The air was thick, unnaturally still. His heart was pounding in his chest, each beat like a drum echoing in his ears. "Who's there?" He called out, his voice hoarse in the quiet. No answer. The footsteps stopped. For a moment the silence was almost deafening. With a deep breath he began his ascent. Each step felt like a small eternity, the darkness pressing in on him from all sides. When he reached the top, he hesitated, shining the flashlight into the hallway. The light bounced off the walls, revealing nothing but shadows. John's eyes flicked toward the room at the end of the hall, the very room that had unsettled him earlier that evening. The door was still shut, the same as it had been for years. But now the air in the hallway felt colder, heavier. He could see his breath in front of him, a faint mist in the beam of the flashlight. The footsteps had stopped, but the house was alive with something else, something that felt like a presence, something watching him from the shadows. He took another cautious step forward, and that's when he heard it again, a slow, deliberate creak of the floorboards above him. He froze, his heart hammering in his chest. There was something or someone upstairs. John's mind raced, his breath coming in quick, shallow bursts. He knew he had to go up there. He had to face whatever it was. But his feet felt like lead, the weight of his own fear keeping him rooted to the spot. The last thing he wanted to do was go into that room. The very thought of it made his stomach turn. But something pulled him forward. He couldn't shake the feeling that if he didn't do something, the unease that gripped him would only grow, festering in the corners of his mind. So, with a steadying breath, he pushed open the door to the bedroom. It was dark, the only light coming from the beam of his flashlight cutting through the room in jagged streaks. The room was just as he had left it, empty, undisturbed and silent. But then, as he stepped further into the room, the floor creaked beneath him. He glanced down and saw that the floorboards, old and weathered, were moving, shifting under an unseen weight. It wasn't the house settling. John's eyes widened as the floorboards groaned again, louder this time, as if something heavy was moving beneath the surface. The room grew colder, the temperature plummeting so quickly it felt like the air itself had frozen. He spun around, his flashlight flicking across the room, but there was nothing but the shadows that seemed to grow longer, darker. The light shone on the bed, and for a brief moment John thought he saw something. A figure just barely perceptible in the dim glow of the flashlight standing at the foot of the bed. It was gone in an instant, as if it had never been there at all. John's heart raced, his breath quick and shallow. "Who's there?" he asked again, his voice trembling. His hands were clammy, the flashlight shaking in his grip. No response, only the sound of his own breathing, ragged and frantic. And then a loud bang. The door to the closet slammed shut behind him, the sudden noise echoing through the room. John jumped, spinning around to face it, his flashlight beam darting to the closet door. The room was silent again, but the air had changed. It was thick with something else now, something that wasn't just fear. It was dread. An unnatural, suffocating presence that seemed to fill every corner of the room. John's mind raced, his thoughts becoming a blur of confusion and fear. He didn't know what was happening. All he knew was that the footsteps, the strange noises, were no longer just figments of his imagination. Something was in the house. Something was in the room with him. He took one step backward, then another. His heart was pounding so loudly he was sure the entire house could hear it. The feeling of being watched, of being hunted, was unbearable. His instincts screamed at him to leave, to get out, to run far away from this place. But his legs wouldn't move. He was frozen, caught in a nightmare he couldn't wake from. The footsteps returned. Soft, slow, measured. They were right above him, moving across the floor above. But there was no one there, no one in the house. The air grew colder still, the temperature dropping to an impossible degree, the chill seeping into his bones. Max's low growl cut through the tension, a warning. But John couldn't move. He couldn't tear his eyes away from the door to the closet or the space beyond it where the darkness seemed to pulse, alive with an unseen force. The room seemed to close in on him, the walls pressing together with a suffocating weight. He could hear the footsteps again, closer now, moving towards him, but they didn't sound like they were coming from above. No, these were coming from behind him, from the closet. John didn't dare look. He couldn't. His chest tightened, his breath coming in ragged gasps. He knew what he had to do. He had to face it, whatever it was. But in the back of his mind, a voice whispered that he wasn't alone, that whatever was in this house was not human. And then the lights went out. The following night, the house seemed even quieter than it had been before. John couldn't shake the nagging feeling that something was wrong, something that had been lurking just beneath the surface for far too long. It wasn't just the strange noises or the footsteps that came from nowhere, nor the cold that seemed to seep into his bones when the rest of the world was warm. No, it was the creeping sensation that the house, once a place of love, had become something else entirely. The room upstairs, the one he'd sworn to never return to, kept calling him back, despite every instinct telling him to stay away. He had to face it. He had to see if his mind was playing tricks on him or if there was something truly sinister, hiding in the corners of his home. He had never been a superstitious man, but after everything that had happened, doubt gnawed at his sanity like a disease. John's mind was a tangled mess as he climbed the stairs, his breath shallow and quick. Max, the ever-faithful dog, trailed behind him, his ears flattened against his head, the fur on his back standing on end. Even the dog could sense the tension, and the unspoken fear between them felt suffocating. John reached the door to the bedroom and paused, taking a deep breath. He could feel the familiar weight of the room pressing against him, as if it had been waiting for him all this time. He opened the door slowly, the creaking hinges like the groan of an ancient beast waking from a long slumber. The room was dimly lit by the moonlight streaming through the half-open window, casting long, angular shadows across the walls. But it wasn't the shadows that made John's stomach tighten. It was the sight that greeted him when he stepped inside. The floor, once immaculate and untouched, was now littered with clothes that belonged to Elena. His heart stopped. They had been carefully packed away after her death, stored in boxes in the back of the closet, sealed up as if to keep her memory at bay. But now they were scattered across the floor as if someone had torn through them in a frenzy. Dresses, blouses, and skirts, clothes he had packed with trembling hands after her passing, lay in a chaotic heap, half draped over the bed, the floor, the chair by the window. It was as if a storm had blown through, and in its wake, Elena's belongings were tossed carelessly aside. John stepped into the room, his body rigid with disbelief. He couldn't breathe. His chest felt as if it were being crushed under an unseen weight, a weight of confusion and terror. The last time he had seen these clothes, they had been neatly folded in boxes, tucked away in the dark corner of the closet. Anger flared in him, but it was cold, chilling, like a knife pressing against his ribs. He had told himself he would never return to this room, not after the way she had died, not after everything that had happened, but here they were, here she was. A low growl broke his train of thought, and John glanced down at Max. The dog was standing in the doorway, staring at the scattered clothes with an intensity that unsettled John. His fur was bristling and his eyes were wide, filled with an almost unnatural alertness. John's breath quickened. He had to get control of himself. He couldn't let this consume him. But the sight of the clothes, her clothes, made it hard to think, hard to focus. His anger turned to panic. How could this have happened? Who had done this? His mind raced for an explanation, but none came. There was no logical reason for this. No one had been in the house. No one had been here. But as John's gaze shifted from the mess of clothes to the bedroom door, he froze. His heart stopped in his chest. Standing there in the doorway was a woman. She was short, hunched slightly, her face obscured by the shadows. She wore an old, tattered dress, nothing like the clothes Alina had worn. The woman's hair was matted, tangled, hanging in strands around her face. John's breath caught in his throat. His mind screamed at him to run, to escape, but his feet were frozen in place. The figure in the doorway didn't move, but John could feel her presence like a cold wind sweeping through the room. "Who are you?" John's voice came out ragged, hoarse. He wanted to shout, to demand answers, but the words stuck in his throat. There was something wrong with this woman, something unnatural about her presence. She wasn't Alina, she couldn't be. The woman tilted her head just slightly as though studying him. Her eyes, dark, hollow, seemed to gleam in the low light, but they weren't full of life. They were empty, as though she wasn't truly there at all. John took a step forward, his heart pounding in his chest. The woman didn't flinch, didn't move. For a moment they just stood there, staring at each other, the tension thick enough to cut with a knife. Then, in an instant, the woman bolted. She turned and fled down the hallway, her footsteps barely audible on the wooden floor. But John didn't follow. He couldn't move. The air had turned cold, colder than it had ever been. He could hear his heartbeat in his ears, his breath shallow and erratic. Max growled again, low and threatening. John snapped out of his stupor and turned toward the door. Without thinking, he bolted after her, his legs shaking with a mixture of fear and adrenaline. But by the time he reached the end of the hallway, the woman was gone. The house was silent again, too silent. His mind was racing. What had just happened? What was that woman? He stood there in the dark hallway, the walls pressing in on him, the air thick with the scent of dust and decay. The house seemed to close in on him, the shadows stretching, shifting as though alive. He could hear nothing but the sound of his own breathing, but he felt it, the presence, lingering just beyond his reach. Max's growl echoed in the distance, and John's heart leapt in his chest. He couldn't shake the feeling that she was still here, somewhere in the house, watching him, waiting. John's mind raced, his thoughts crashing against one another. The woman in the room, she had been real. She had been standing there looking at him. But who was she? And why had she been in the house? With trembling hands, John made his way back to the bedroom, the clothes still scattered across the floor. His eyes moved slowly over the scene, the pile of Alina's things now tainted by something he couldn't quite grasp. His heart was a mess of fear and confusion. He needed answers, but every part of him was screaming that the answers he was searching for were better left undiscovered. John stood there for what felt like an eternity, the weight of the room pressing in on him. The house was alive with something he couldn't name, something that had been hiding, waiting for the right moment to show itself. But what if it wasn't just waiting? What if it had always been here, right under his nose? John stood at the edge of the living room, his hand gripping the doorframe so tightly his knuckles turned white. The air in the house was thick, oppressive, like something had been added to the atmosphere, something unseen but very present. The silence was deafening, and yet it was broken intermittently by strange noises, soft at first, then more insistent. John's mind screamed at him to dismiss it, to tell himself that it was just his imagination, but the longer he stood there, the more impossible that explanation seemed. A distant clinking noise echoed from the kitchen, dishes rattling, glasses tapping against one another as though someone were in the room. But he hadn't been in the kitchen all day. He hadn't touched anything. He wasn't even hungry. John took a step forward, his muscles tight with a tension he couldn't shake. The house felt wrong, the same wrongness that had been slowly growing inside him since Alina's death. It was suffocating, inescapable, and no matter how many times he told himself it was all in his head, the fear never seemed to let go. He hesitated for a moment, then walked cautiously toward the kitchen. The soft creak of his boots on the hardwood floor seemed louder than ever, breaking the stillness around him. The clinking had stopped, but the atmosphere had not lightened. It felt thick, almost damp. He reached the kitchen doorway and peered inside. The lights were flickering, the bulb sputtering in the dim room, casting erratic shadows that seemed to twist and shift unnaturally on the walls. He stood in the doorway for a moment, frozen. The kitchen looked normal, but there was something deeply unsettling about it. The counter was clear, the stove turned off, and the dishes he had left in the sink were gone, vanished. He hadn't cleaned up after breakfast, hadn't touched a thing since. But now they were gone, leaving no trace of their existence behind. John's pulse quickened. His heart began to hammer in his chest, and for a moment he felt lightheaded. His mind screamed for answers. He couldn't make sense of this. A thud behind him jolted him out of his stupor, followed by a loud crash, then another. The glasses, the plates, everything. They were rattling, shaking violently on the counter, as though unseen hands were wreaking havoc on the kitchen. The sound of clattering porcelain was deafening, echoing through the house like a symphony of chaos, but there was nothing in the room, nothing except him. John backed away, his breathing shallow and erratic, his mind spinning with 1,000 thoughts. What the hell is happening? His voice was hoarse, barely above a whisper, but the words felt like they didn't belong in the air, as though the house itself rejected them. The lights flickered again, and this time the bulb above his head buzzed, the electric hum so loud it hurt his ears. Then they went out. Darkness. He fumbled for his flashlight, his hands trembling as he turned it on. The beam sliced through the darkness, illuminating the kitchen briefly. The counters were still. No more rattling, no more clinking, just silence, suffocating and unnatural. John's heart pounded in his ears, the sound loud and rhythmic, matching the thudding of his pulse. He stepped back, only to freeze again as his eyes caught the reflection in the kitchen window. Something was standing there. At first it looked like nothing, just shadows and the empty yard beyond, but then slowly it materialized. The same woman. Her figure was barely visible in the dim glow of the flashlight, her tattered dress swaying slightly as she stood in the garden staring at him. Her face was hidden, her features obscured by the dark, but the way she stood there, motionless, watching, made John's blood run cold. Max's growl broke the silence. The dog, who had been quiet, now stood at the door, his hackles raised, his teeth bared in a low snarl. Max was usually the protector, the one who kept danger at bay, but tonight he was not acting like himself. His tail was tucked between his legs, his body stiff with fear. "Max," John whispered, taking a hesitant step forward. The woman didn't move. She just stood there, unmoving, her form a dark silhouette against the faint glow of moonlight. John's chest tightened. His breath became shallow, his throat dry as he stared at her. Was it a ghost, a spirit from the past? His mind tried to make sense of it all, but the more he tried to rationalize it, the more the reality of what was happening seemed to slip away. He couldn't think straight. He took a step forward, his breath freezing in his throat. The ground beneath his feet felt unreal, the air thicker with each step. The woman, the figure in the garden, still didn't move. She just stared at him, her presence suffocating, like the very essence of her being was wrapped in shadow. And then, just as suddenly as she appeared, she vanished. John froze, blinking rapidly, his flashlight beam cutting through the spot where she had been just a moment ago. But there was nothing there. The garden was empty. Max's growl shifted into a whimper, and John's heart skipped a beat. The dog was pacing in circles near the door, now clearly agitated. John could feel the pulse of fear coursing through his veins, but the worst part was the silence that followed the disappearance. It wasn't just the absence of the woman. It was the feeling that something was still there, watching, waiting. John stood at the door for several minutes, trying to steady his breath, trying to make sense of the events, but nothing made sense. Max's whine broke him from his thoughts, and he turned to face the dog. But the dog wouldn't move. Max was pressed up against the door, his head lowered, eyes wide, fixed on the outside. His body was rigid, his legs shaking slightly. John's stomach clenched and he looked toward the door, but the fear held him in place. "Max!" His voice trembled, a soft sound in the oppressive silence. Max's response was nothing like John had ever seen before. The dog, usually so brave, was now completely unnerved. His fur was bristling and he refused to go outside, even when John reached for the door handle. The protective, loyal dog that had kept John company through his darkest days was now a quivering mess of fear. He wouldn't leave the room. He wouldn't leave the safety of the walls. That was when it hit John. The fear wasn't just his. It wasn't just something he was imagining. Max could feel it too. Whatever presence lingered in the house, whatever had made the dishes rattle, whatever had made that woman appear in the yard, it wasn't just a figment of his imagination. It was real. It was in the house, and it wasn't leaving. John stepped back, his mind racing with questions, with fear. His thoughts jumbled together as he tried to make sense of it all. Was this the same woman he had seen before? Was this something far worse? Max's whimpers only heightened his terror, his inability to leave the room or even the house, growing stronger with each passing moment. John knew deep down that there was something far more dangerous than he had ever imagined lurking just beyond the walls. Max knew it too, and it was only getting worse. John sat in his car, the engine running softly, as the cold desert air pressed against the windows. The faint hum of the tires on the gravel driveway was the only sound in the oppressive silence of the night. He gripped the shotgun tightly in his hands, his knuckles white from the pressure. His breath came in shallow bursts, and every few seconds he wiped the sweat from his brow, the palms of his hands clammy despite the chill outside. He hadn't slept in days. Not since the strange woman had appeared, no, since she had been here. The clothes, the footsteps, the lights flickering. It was all too much to ignore, too much to push away. And tonight he was going to do something about it. He couldn't let the fear control him any longer. He couldn't let this thing, this presence, continue to haunt him. Not again. But as the hours ticked by, as the darkness deepened around him, the fear only seemed to tighten its grip on him. His mind raced, questioning every creak, every shift in the shadows. The woman, the figure, had been appearing, disappearing with no rhyme or reason. Was she real? Was she a ghost? Was she something else altogether? John didn't know, but tonight he was going to find out. He sat up straighter in his seat, eyes fixed on the house. The eerie glow of the moon cast long shadows across the walls, making the house look like something from a nightmare. The windows were dark, lifeless. His house had never felt so hollow, so empty. As the clock struck midnight, John's heartbeat quickened. He thought he saw it there, a flicker of movement near the far end of the yard. There she was, the woman, standing in the same spot where he had seen her before, near the garden, where the shadows seemed to swallow everything in their wake. Her presence was unmistakable, as though the air itself bent around her, thickening with something unspeakable. John's breath caught in his throat. She was back, but this time he wouldn't wait. He opened the car door slowly, as quietly as possible, but the sound still seemed deafening in the stillness of the night. His feet hit the gravel with a soft crunch as he stepped out, his heart pounding with each step that took him closer to the house. The shotgun was heavy in his hands, but it steadied him. He took a deep breath, his eyes never leaving the figure standing in the yard. She wasn't moving, just standing there, waiting, her form barely discernible in the darkness. The same dark, tattered dress, the same pale, empty face. There was no expression, no movement. "Leave," John shouted into the still night. His voice cracked as he spoke the words, as though he were unsure whether they would reach her at all. She didn't respond. He moved closer, his legs trembling with the adrenaline coursing through him. The shadows stretched and warped around her, but still she stood motionless, a silhouette against the garden. She seemed almost unreal, but she was real. She had to be. "Leave." John shouted again, his voice growing louder. "Get out of here." The woman's eyes flickered briefly as if acknowledging his presence, but still she didn't move. There was no sign of fear or emotion in her, just an empty stare that sent a shiver down his spine. With his hand shaking, John raised the shotgun, the barrel pointing toward her, his finger tightening on the trigger. He was so close now, close enough to see the details of her figure. Her dress, tattered and stained, hung loosely on her body, moving with the wind like the remnants of something long forgotten. Her hair, matted and unkempt, cascaded over her shoulders like a veil, obscuring her face. He was mere steps away from her now, his breath shallow, his heart racing. And then, just as his finger was about to pull the trigger, she vanished. She was gone. John froze, his eyes darting around the yard, his breath catching in his throat. There was no trace of her. No sign that she had ever been there at all. The air, once thick with her presence, was suddenly still, too still. The shotgun lowered in his hands, his body stiff with disbelief. His mind screamed at him to understand what had just happened, but he couldn't. There was no explanation, no answer. She had been standing right in front of him. And then nothing. The wind rustled the branches of the trees, but it was the only sound. Everything else, the footsteps, the growling of Max, the overwhelming sense of presence, had fallen silent, as though the world had gone quiet, waiting for him to process what had just transpired. But he couldn't. He stood there for what felt like hours, staring at the spot where she had been. His heartbeat had not slowed. It had grown louder, more frantic, as if demanding that he do something, anything, to understand the events of the night. He turned around, his legs like jelly beneath him, and walked slowly back toward the house, his shotgun still clutched in his hand. Max was still at the door, standing guard as though nothing had happened. The dog's eyes were wide, fixed on the yard outside, but he made no sound, no growl, no bark, just the same nervous energy that John had seen in him for days now. "Max," John whispered, his voice hoarse. "Max, it's over." But the dog didn't respond. John stepped inside the house, the door closing with a heavy thud behind him. He leaned against the wall, his hand still gripping the shotgun, his breath ragged. His mind was reeling, trying to make sense of the events that had unfolded in front of him. She had been there, in the yard, and now she was gone. But John couldn't shake the feeling that she had left something behind. A mark, an impression. The very air seemed to buzz with energy, heavy with an unspoken threat. The silence around him was deafening, but beneath it there was something darker, something that couldn't be ignored. John couldn't sleep. He lay in bed, staring at the ceiling, his mind filled with the vision of the woman in the yard, her empty, lifeless stare. The terror that had gripped him before, the sense of her presence, still clung to him like a second skin. And the fear was growing. The fear that this wasn't over. The fear that she wasn't gone. She would be back. The hours stretched on into the night, each one more unbearable than the last. John tossed and turned, his mind unable to quiet. His every muscle felt tight, his heart a constant drumbeat in his chest. The shadows in the corners of the room seemed to stretch farther than they should, and every creak, every snap of a twig outside the window sent a jolt of panic through him. Max's low growl echoed from the hallway, distant but unmistakable. John sat up in bed, his throat dry, his pulse racing. The house, no, the nightmare was far from over. The terror that had been unleashed was only just beginning to take hold of him, and he was powerless to stop it. John sat hunched over the kitchen table, a cup of coffee long gone cold beside him, his eyes fixed on the worn pages of an old book he'd found in a second-hand store in town. His hand shook slightly as he turned the pages, each one revealing a piece of Sedona's dark and twisted past. He had been searching for answers for days, weeks now, and every new discovery seemed to bring more questions, more terrifying possibilities. The house had been silent for hours, but the silence had taken on an oppressive quality. It wasn't the same silence as before the footsteps, before the flickering lights and the woman in the yard. No, this was something deeper, more suffocating. The house had become a tomb, a place where the past lingered just as heavily as the present, and every day that John spent here he felt himself slipping further and further into its grasp. The woman, the figure, she had haunted his thoughts, her face, though obscured by shadows, had etched itself into his mind. He couldn't stop thinking about her, her movements, her presence. The way she stood, waiting, watching. Was she real, or was she something else? Something that had been drawn to the house, to him. John had to know. He needed answers. The pages of the book rustled as he flipped through them, each one revealing the legends, the strange occurrences that had plagued Sedona for generations. His eyes scanned the words, hungrily searching for a connection, for something that could explain the haunting that had taken hold of him. And then, in a faded paragraph, he found it. The legend of the woman who died years ago. Her name was Lillian Price. She had lived in Sedona in the late 1800s, a woman whose life had been marked by strange and tragic events. According to the book, Lillian had been found dead in her home one stormy night, her body twisted in unnatural ways, as if she had been thrown around by some invisible force. No one knew what had happened to her. Some said she had been taken by a spirit, something vengeful. Others whispered about a curse, something that had followed her family for generations. John's heart thudded in his chest. Lillian's death had been shrouded in mystery, much like Elena's. But the most chilling part of the legend was the way the townspeople spoke of her. They said that her spirit still haunted the land, unable to find peace, bound to the place of her death by some unspoken tragedy. John's fingers hovered over the page, his mind racing. The more he read, the more he felt that strange sense of recognition, the connection to his own life, to the strange occurrences in his home. The woman who had been haunting him, it wasn't just a coincidence. He had been drawn to her somehow. Her spirit had been looking for him. As he read on, another piece of the puzzle clicked into place. The legend mentioned a group of settlers from the early 1800s, men and women who had come to Sedona to build their homes, to claim the land for themselves. But they had made a grave mistake. They had disturbed an ancient burial ground. The settlers, unaware of the sacredness of the land they had chosen, had built their homes on the very spot where an ancient Native American tribe had once lived, worshipped, and died. The burial ground, long abandoned, had been untouched for centuries until the settlers had come. And when they began to build, the spirits of the dead had awakened. It was said that the land had become cursed, haunted by the vengeful souls of those who had been disturbed. The settlers had paid the price for their ignorance with their lives, one by one, until there were none left. John's breath caught in his throat. The settlers had disturbed something ancient, something powerful, and it had come for them. And now, decades later, it was coming for him, for his family, for his home. He leaned back in his chair, the weight of the discovery pressing down on him. The connections were too strong to ignore. The woman, Lillian, the settlers, the land, it all tied together, and it all led back to his house, to the very place he had thought he could escape from. But there was no escape, not now, not with the house pulling him deeper into its grip. John closed the book with a snap, his mind swirling with the implications of what he had just learned. He needed to find out more about Lillian, about the curse, about the spirits that still haunted Sedona. But the more he learned, the more he feared what he would uncover. The history of this land was drenched in death, in pain, and in tragedy, and it was a history that refused to stay buried. John stood up, pacing the room as his mind raced. He felt trapped, trapped by the house, trapped by the land, trapped by the spirits that seemed to be closing in on him. He had thought that by staying here, by locking himself away from the world, he could outrun the ghosts of his past. But now he knew there was nowhere to hide. The spirits were not bound by the walls of his house. They were bound by the land, by the very earth he stood on. He had been drawn here, drawn to this place, just as the settlers had been centuries before. He couldn't leave, not now, not after what he had learned. John's thoughts were interrupted by a soft thump from above. His eyes snapped toward the ceiling, and for a moment he thought he heard the unmistakable sound of footsteps, slow and deliberate, moving across the floor above him. He froze, his heart in his throat. The sound continued, closer now, closer than it had ever been. John's instincts screamed at him to run, to leave, to get out, but he couldn't. He knew he couldn't, not anymore. The footsteps were getting louder. And then, from the corner of his eye, he saw it, another flash of movement, the same woman, the same figure standing in the doorway, staring at him with hollow eyes. She didn't move. She just stood there, watching him, waiting. John's breath caught in his throat. His legs refused to move. He was paralyzed, trapped in the grip of something far worse than fear. He was being hunted. John's obsession with the house had started innocently enough, just a desire to find answers, to calm his fraying nerves. But as days stretched into nights, the house seemed to sink deeper into his mind, clawing at him from the inside. The air itself felt thick with secrets. He had already uncovered so much: Lillian Price, the settlers, the curse on the land, but there was still something he couldn't quite grasp. Something his wife, Alina, had hidden from him. It had been there all along, buried beneath the surface, in the very bones of the house and the land it sat on. As he sat alone in the dim light of the study, his hands trembling as he sifted through old journals, letters, and photographs. A dark truth began to reveal itself. It was a story that Alina had never shared with him, a part of her life that she had kept locked away, hidden in the shadows of their home. He had always known there were parts of her past she had never spoken of, but he hadn't known how deep the silence ran. It started with an old letter, yellowed with age, stuffed between two faded photographs of a place John didn't recognize. It was a photograph of a small cabin in the woods, his house, but from long ago. The letter was written by Alina's great-grandfather, and as John read, his heart clenched. The words told of a time when Alina's family had first settled in Sedona, when the land had been wild, untamed, and untouched by modern hands. It spoke of strange happenings in the area, mysterious disappearances, unexplained deaths, and a growing sense of dread that seemed to hang over the land like a fog. Alina's great-grandfather had written about a curse, something ancient and malevolent buried deep beneath the earth, waiting for the right moment to awaken. He had spoken of strange rituals that had been performed on the land to try and appease the spirits that dwelled there. But it had been too late. The damage had already been done, and Alina's family, just like the settlers before them, had disturbed something far more dangerous than they had realized. John's breath quickened as he turned the page. The next letter was from Alina herself, a letter she had written to her brother before her death. It was tucked into a drawer in her old writing desk, hidden beneath a pile of unopened envelopes. He had never thought to look in it before, never suspected that Alina had been keeping things from him. But now it was all there in her own words. She had known. She had known about the spirits, about the curse, about the land. The letter detailed how Alina had experienced strange visions in the months before her death, visions of a woman standing in their bedroom, staring at her with hollow eyes, just as John had seen her. She wrote about the eerie whispers that filled the night, the sensation of being watched even when she was alone. She had felt the presence of something in the house, something ancient and relentless. The spirits had been trying to communicate with her. They had been trying to reach out, but Alina had not understood, not at first. John's heart pounded in his chest. He had never known. He had never suspected that Alina had been living with this fear, with these haunting experiences in the months before her death. The woman, the figure he had seen, the one that had tormented him, wasn't just haunting him. She had haunted Alina too. And somehow, Alina's death had set something off. Something darker, something more dangerous had been awakened by her passing. He was too late. Alina had tried to tell him, tried to warn him, but now it was all out of his reach. The force that had taken her was still here, still in the house, still tied to the land. And now it was coming for him. John pushed the letters aside, his mind spinning. He needed to understand, needed to know more. He grabbed the journal that had been Alina's, flipping through the pages frantically. The entries became more frantic as time went on, the handwriting messier, more erratic. Alina had written about the growing sense of dread, about the pressure she felt, the weight of the spirits pressing in on her. She had begun to fear that she was losing her mind, that the forces in the house were too strong for her to fight alone. But she had continued to stay, continued to search for answers, for ways to stop what was happening to her. John slammed the journal shut, his head spinning. The weight of it all was too much to bear. Alina had known. She had known that something was wrong with this house, with this land, but there was nothing she could do to stop it. And now the very thing she had been trying to fight was coming for him. The air in the room seemed to thicken, the shadows creeping closer, pressing against him. His mind raced, the pieces of the puzzle falling into place, but each revelation only led to more questions, more terror. He could feel it, the weight of the spirits, the malevolent presence that had been haunting him since Alina's death. It wasn't just a haunting, it was a curse. John's thoughts were interrupted by a low, guttural sound. It was coming from the hallway, Max's growl. It wasn't the low, protective growl John had grown accustomed to. No, this was something else. It was deep, primal, filled with fear. Max had never been afraid of anything, but now he was shaking, his teeth bared, his hackles raised. John's heart skipped a beat. He jumped up from the chair, rushing to the door, his pulse quickening. The growl grew louder, more insistent, but Max didn't stop. He wasn't barking. He wasn't reacting to an intruder or an animal. He was reacting to something far worse. John opened the door cautiously, his eyes scanning the hallway. Max was standing at the far end, near the stairs, staring into the darkness. His body was rigid, his fur bristling with tension. And then through the darkness, John saw it, a figure, a shadow, the same woman. She was standing in the hallway, watching him. John's heart stopped. His breath caught in his throat. He couldn't move. His feet felt like they were cemented to the floor. The woman was still there, her form just barely visible in the dim light. She was the same as before, her features obscured, her presence like a suffocating fog. And then she began to move. John's pulse raced as she took a step forward, her movements slow and deliberate. He could see her now, her tattered dress flowing around her, her hair hanging in strands over her face. She wasn't just a shadow anymore. She was real, and she was walking toward him. Max's growl turned into a desperate whine as he backed away, retreating into the corner of the hallway. The woman kept coming, and John could feel the air grow colder with each step she took. "No," John whispered, his voice shaking. "No," but the woman didn't stop. She moved closer, closer still, until she was standing in front of him. She was inches away, close enough that John could feel the cold emanating from her, the oppressive weight of her presence. And then, just as he thought he would collapse from the sheer terror of it all, she vanished. The darkness swallowed her whole, and John was left standing in the hallway, breathless, shaking, unable to understand what had just happened. His heart was pounding in his chest, his mind whirling with confusion and dread. Max, still trembling, slowly moved toward John, his eyes wide with fear. The dog nuzzled John's leg as if seeking comfort, as if trying to pull him out of the nightmare he had just witnessed. John collapsed against the wall, his legs giving out beneath him. He couldn't breathe. His thoughts were a blur. This wasn't just a haunting. This was something worse, something far more dangerous, and it was only just beginning. The house seemed to breathe. John could feel it deep in his bones as he stood at the threshold of the living room, his body stiff with dread and anticipation. The quiet hum of his own heartbeat was the only thing that filled his ears as he slowly surveyed the dimly lit room. The shadows that clung to the walls seemed to sway, as if they were alive, watching him, waiting for him to make a move. The entire house, once a home, once a refuge, had transformed into something else, something darker. It was no longer just a building filled with memories. Now it was a living nightmare. John knew he had to face it, all of it. The woman, the spirits, the curse that had haunted this land for so long. He couldn't run any longer. Not from the house, not from the horrors that lurked in every corner. Not from the dark, oppressive force that had been stalking him from the very moment he stepped foot in Sedona. He had spent days, weeks studying, reading everything he could about the history of the house, the curse, the spirits that plagued this land. Every discovery had only deepened his fear, but it had also given him the knowledge he needed to face what was coming. Armed with the journals, the letters, the knowledge of what had happened here, John had finally come to a terrifying conclusion. This wasn't just about the spirits or the house. This was about breaking the curse, about stopping whatever had been set in motion centuries ago. He had to destroy it once and for all. It was time. He gripped the shotgun tightly in his hands, his knuckles white. The cool steel of the weapon was a comfort, but it couldn't protect him from the thing he was about to face. This wasn't something that could be fought with bullets. It was something far older, far darker than anything he had ever known. The house seemed to sense his resolve. The air shifted, thickening with an unnatural energy. It was as though the walls themselves were alive, pressing in on him, the very foundation of the house groaning under an unseen weight. The temperature dropped sharply, and John's breath turned to mist in front of him, each exhale a cloud of cold, biting air. Suddenly, the lights flickered above him. The sound of creaking floorboards echoed through the house, followed by a soft thud, then another. The sounds were coming from everywhere, from the walls, from the ceiling, from the very floor beneath his feet. Then the doors slammed shut one by one with violent force. John flinched, his heart pounding in his chest. He felt the darkness closing in, suffocating him, pressing down on him. But still he stood his ground. This was it. This was the moment he had been preparing for, the moment when everything he had learned, everything he had discovered would come to a head. The house groaned again, and then silence. For a brief moment it seemed as though the house itself had gone still, waiting. And then, as if summoned by some unseen force, the woman appeared. She stood at the far end of the room, her figure barely visible in the dim light, her pale face obscured by shadows. Her hair hung in strands around her face, her body draped in the tattered remnants of a dress. She didn't move, but John could feel the weight of her presence, the suffocating aura of death that hung around her like a shroud. John's pulse quickened as he raised the shotgun, his hands shaking. "Why are you here?" he demanded, his voice hoarse, almost desperate. "What do you want?" The woman didn't respond. Instead, she stepped forward, her movements slow and deliberate. Her eyes, dark, empty, met his, and in that moment John felt a cold, piercing fear unlike anything he had ever known. He knew deep down that this was the moment. This was the spirit he had been running from, spirit that had been tormenting him since the night he arrived. The force that had been pulling him deeper into the house, deeper into the curse that haunted Sedona. The woman opened her mouth, her lips barely moving. "You shouldn't have come," she whispered, her voice barely audible, but it was enough. John took a step back, his heart racing. "Who are you?" he shouted, his voice trembling. "Why are you doing this?" The woman's lips curled into a twisted smile, and for the first time, John saw something else in her eyes, a flicker of understanding, a flicker of something human. "I am trapped," she whispered, her voice distant, almost mournful. "Trapped by the land, trapped by the curse, just like you." John's breath caught in his throat, trapped. The weight of the words settled heavily in the air, and John's mind reeled. The woman wasn't just a spirit, she was a part of the curse, a part of something far older than he could comprehend. She had been here for years, maybe centuries, bound to the house, to the land, by a force beyond her control. And now John understood. She wasn't haunting him, she was trying to warn him. But the warning came too late. The air turned icy cold, and a sudden gust of wind whipped through the room, slamming the doors shut with a deafening bang. The woman's form wavered before him, flickering like a dying candle. Her features began to distort, her face twisting in agony, as though something within her was being torn apart. "You have to break it," she gasped, her voice raw, desperate. "The curse, the land, you have to destroy it before it consumes you." Before she could say more, the air around her seemed to crackle with energy. The shadows grew deeper, thicker, until they were no longer just shadows. They were things. Shapes that swirled and stretched, forming into grotesque, writhing creatures that crawled from the darkness. Their eyes gleamed with malice, their bodies twisted and contorted in ways that defied nature. John's heart hammered in his chest as the creatures circled him, their cold eyes locked on him, their movements jerky and unnatural. He could feel the weight of their presence, the darkness closing in around him. They weren't just spirits, they were manifestations of the curse itself. The land's punishment come to life. He had to end this. He had no choice. The woman's image flickered once more, her voice weak, barely a whisper. "Destroy it. Break the curse. Before it's too late." John raised the shotgun once again, his hands trembling, but this time he didn't hesitate. With a deafening crack, the gunshot rang through the room. The sound shattered the silence, and in that moment the world seemed to freeze. The creatures shrieked in pain, their forms dissolving into smoke as the blast tore through them. The house itself groaned, the walls shaking as though the very foundation was being ripped apart. The darkness recoiled and the creatures vanished, their presence lingering only as a memory. The woman, Lillian, stood before him, her form flickering once more. This time, however, she didn't seem angry or malevolent. She seemed relieved. Her face, twisted with torment, slowly softened, and for the first time since John had seen her, she smiled. "Thank you," she whispered, her voice barely audible as she faded into nothingness. The house was silent once again. John stood there, his breath shallow, his heart still racing. As the weight of what had just happened settled over him, the curse had been broken. The spirits, the forces that had tormented him were finally free, but the relief was fleeting. His body shook from the adrenaline, his mind still reeling from the horrors he had witnessed. The house, once filled with shadows and fear, was now quiet, empty. But John knew deep in his soul that things could never be the same. He had faced the darkness and he had survived. But the cost had been high. His once peaceful life, his sense of normalcy, had been shattered forever. He was no longer the man who had walked into Sedona all those months ago. And as he left the house behind, stepping out into the cool desert night, he knew one thing for sure. No matter how far he ran, the memories of the cursed land and its restless spirits would follow him forever. John Walker's journey in Sedona was more than just a fight against the supernatural. It was a battle against the unknown, a confrontation with the darkest parts of his own mind, and a reckoning with the forces that have shaped the land for centuries. What began as an eerie, inexplicable haunting quickly grew into something much deeper, a curse that tied John to a past he had never known, to a house that had long been a prison for the souls of the restless dead. Throughout his experience, John had to face not only the terror of the spirits that stalked him, but also the painful truth about his wife, Elena. The secrets she had hidden from him, the knowledge she had kept about the spirits haunting the house, led John to realize that he was not just the victim of a haunting. He was tied to a much larger, darker force that had been brewing for generations. Elena's death had been a catalyst, awakening a curse that had laid dormant, waiting for the right moment to strike. And as John uncovered the painful history of the land, he was forced to confront the truth that there was no escaping the past. The spirits of the settlers, the ancient burial ground, and the woman's tragic fate were all interconnected, bound together by a curse that could only be broken through sacrifice and courage. The final showdown in the house, the destruction of the spirits, and the breaking of the curse was not just a physical battle. It was a fight for John's very soul. In the end, his survival depended not on his ability to fight, but on his ability to face the truth, to understand the past, and to take action, no matter how terrifying it was. Though John was left scarred by his experiences, he emerged victorious, having freed the spirits trapped in the house and broken the curse that had plagued the land for so long. But even after the house fell silent, even after the darkness faded, John's life was forever changed. The memories of those dark nights in Sedona would remain with him, haunting him in ways he could not predict. And though the terror had ended, the lessons he had learned about courage, fear, and the weight of history would stay with him always. The story of John Walker serves as a profound reminder that we cannot run from our past, no matter how much we wish to escape it. The ghosts that haunt us, the fears that cripple us, and the mistakes we make, all of these are part of who we are. We cannot move forward without first understanding and confronting what lies behind us. Just as John had to face the spirits of the past to break the curse, we too must face our own fears and the weight of our history in order to free ourselves from the things that hold us back. The story also teaches us about resilience and courage in the face of the unknown. John's journey shows that, while we may be afraid of what lurks in the dark, it is only by confronting it head-on that we can find peace and move forward. We all have our own struggles, our own demons to face, but by facing them with courage and seeking the truth, we can overcome even the most terrifying obstacles. What do you think of John's journey? Do you believe that confronting our fears and understanding the past is the key to overcoming the darkness that haunts us? I'd love to hear your thoughts. Please feel free to share your opinions in the comments below, and let's discuss this chilling story together. Don't forget to subscribe to Whispers in the Dark for more gripping tales, and show your support to keep the channel alive with more thrilling content. Your feedback and support inspire us to bring you even more stories like this one.